Hello, my name's Dr. Stewart Desson. I'm going to be sharing with you now a talk I gave just last week at the British Psychological Society's Division of Occupational Psychology Conference up in Stratford-upon-Avon. And this is work undertaken by myself and Nailah Moussa on the validation of the Lumina Spark 24 qualities with the Great 8 competencies. In terms of the structure of this short video, I'm going to give you an overview of the Lumina Spark model, and then I'm going to move into the purpose of the research, something on the design methodology, share with you the results, and then draw out a few of the conclusions. In terms of an overview of the Lumina Spark model, this is the 4-factor version of the Lumina Spark model that we'll be looking at in this video. There is of course a 5-factor version available too, but this research is based on the 4 factors. So here they are: conscientiousness, openness to experience, extroversion and agreeableness. And the key thing about the Lumina Spark model is that it measures both ends of the polarity. So yes, we've measured extroversion, but independently we've also measured introversion. Yes, we've measured conscientiousness, which in fact is discipline driven, but we've also measured the opposite, which we've termed inspiration driven. That's fundamental to the Lumina Spark methodology, and one reason for doing this is to reduce what's called evaluative bias, and the other is to enhance user validity. Now, the measures here can be taken to a higher level, and the 2 higher order factors as identified by Digman and de Jong are also present here in beta and plasticity on the left hand side of the screen and alpha stability on the right hand side of the screen. The model measures these traits adaptively, that is in a sort of a neutral or a slightly positive way that's likely to be helpful at work. And here the traits in the model have been put into a circumflex format according to how they correlate. So traits are next to each other if they have a high correlation, which means that as you work around the circular model, when you get to the opposite side, there's likely to be a negative correlation between the traits that are directly opposite each other on the model. Because we're measuring both ends, terminology is being created to measure both ends, so it's not that one end's positive, the other negative. So if we have a look here at openness, it's been framed as big picture thinking, but the opposite, or being closed or not open, has been called being down to earth, cautious, evidence-based and practical. So if we just jump through the big 5 here, or the first 4 of the big 5, there's conscientiousness, there's extroversion, and there's agreeableness. Now, one feature of the Lumina Spark model is that it also measures these traits maladaptively. That is in a way that in certain contexts could well be unhelpful to your competencies at work, or could be considered to be maladaptively. And this is simply done through measuring sort of too much of a good thing. This does pose some questions around the Lumina Spark model. I mean, why bother measuring both ends of the big 5 traits? Because actually to do so pretty much doubles the size of the questionnaire. And why measure adaptive, which in this model combines what we call underlying and everyday traits, underlying being more dispositional, everyday having a stronger behavioural component, and maladaptive is the too much of a good thing, because that at least doubles the number of items again. So these are good questions that we need to answer. Well, there's 3 answers really. They don't map directly to the 3 answers above, but collectively. So to mitigate evaluative bias, Peabody in 1967 identified that measuring both ends of a scale positively and negatively aggregates out some of the biases and reduces the bias overall. If we want to improve criterion validity through greater fidelity, then having a broader measure of a construct at both ends for certain competencies can improve criterion validity. This is an interesting perspective, as traditionally I was led to believe that focusing on reducing evaluative bias may have a negative impact on criterion validity, but that's not what's been found in this study. And the third answer is about valuing different ways of being in the workplace. If we really want to value deep diversity and if we want to value people who traditionally in a psychometric wouldn't be measured so positively. So introverted people, low in conscientiousness, that might be low in emotional stability. Actually, we need to recalibrate the model and measure both ends constructively, adaptively, as well as maladaptively. So it's a benefit in terms of measuring and valuing different ways of being. So these are the reasons for doing it. Here's an example of evaluative bias in action in our culture. So an extrovert, someone, they're energized by interacting with others. An introvert, they run away from others. Now, it's humorous, but there's a degree of bias in it. And it's understandable in different cultures that there could be biases, which will vary by culture. Nevertheless, we would hope not to have bias in our psychometric measurement, but the truth is we do. And part of the design of Spark is to mitigate that bias. Here are the trait descriptive adjectives as created by Goldberg back in 1992, and his paper highlights the prominent role of factor analysis in choosing the best 10 adjectives in the English language to measure extroversion and the best 10 to measure introversion. And the evaluative bias here is pretty clear for even a lay person to see. So extroversion is unrestrained, energetic, daring, bold, and so on. And introversion is timid, withdrawn, bashful, shy. And in my experience, even just sharing this with people who are more introverted, they're not so keen to be described by these introverted adjectives. It doesn't appeal to them so much. Of course, that doesn't mean that it doesn't give a good factor analysis and is justifiable statistically. But Peterson et al. Have nicely identified how these evaluative biases can emerge in models, and it is through the use of factor analysis. So here they say, when an evaluatively unbalanced set of descriptors, such as the big 5 adjectival markers as created by Goldberg, it's subjected to a simple structure rotation algorithm, then the factors invariably end up contrasting positive and negative descriptors. And this actually is the source of, one of the sources of the evaluative bias. So put another way, you have to make a conscious effort to mitigate evaluative bias in this process if the factor analysis won't naturally guide you down that route. What do we mean here by bias? Well, there's valence and there's descriptive content. And valence is, do I see this item in the questionnaire as positive or negative, which may have something to do with my self-construct, my self-esteem and so on, as opposed to the descriptive content of an item, which is truly describing the polarity of the big 5. So here's the risk. The risk is, if I have a more negative self-construct, I'm slightly more likely to agree with negatively evaluated items. And if my let's say my introverted items are described slightly more negatively, I might be inclined to tick it more, even if I'm not as introverted. And also the other way around, if I have a very positive self-construct, I'm slightly more likely to agree with the extroverted items if they're framed in very positive terms. This could be picked up on by the general factor of personality, one component of which is in fact valence and social desirability. If we take an item here, as an extroverted item, I make new friends easily. Let's have a look at an introverted item. Sometimes I listen too much and don't give my view. I would argue the extroverted item is being measured adaptively and the introverted one maladaptively. It's less inclined to be helpful in the workplace. We can, of course, using the Peabody 1967 method, measure introversion more adaptively. I choose my words carefully before I speak. That could be helpful at work. And we can look at the maladaptive form of extroversion. Sometimes I talk too much, which could, in certain contexts, be unhelpful. Maybe not if I'm networking in certain areas, but if I'm doing analysis and so on with other people, it could be quite destructive. By balancing all four, this helps us. It helps us reduce evaluative bias because the biases are netted out across all four. It also helps us from a user validity perspective to get a richer interpretation of the data, and it helps an individual better interpret and have a better dialogue around who they are and their personality. For example, I could be quite adaptive in how I express my introversion and more maladaptive in my extroversion, or any interesting combination of those things, and that's pretty useful to know. Here's Jupiter as pictured a number of years ago as a static planet, and in the many years ago we only had static images of Jupiter, but now we can get up closer with better technology, and we can see how things are changing over time, and there is a dynamic at work on the planet, and so too with personality. We're not just one flat personality. The context will create a dynamic in our personality. The aging process will create a dynamic in our personality, and how much we bring our conscious will to a situation to tune up and tune down even within a given day will have an impact on our personality. So we're now looking at a view of personality that's much more dynamic in nature than maybe we previously were led to believe. Now this is important because as Bruce Grossman said, if you stick your head in the oven and your feet in the freezer, on average you'll be comfortable. On average, Stewart is fairly agreeable. If I do the Neo, I come out 55, 60%, somewhere in the mid-range. But actually, if I undertake Lumina Spark, it turns out I'm highly empathetic, highly people-focused, highly agreeable, and actually highly disagreeable, although in the Spark model, that's called outcome-focused. I'm quite logical, I've got a competitive streak, and I'll argue, and that can be very helpful, particularly in a research context. So it's helpful not always to average things out. It has a good benefit to the user validity. Here's an example from my good colleague Nikita, and we've further cracked out the adaptive behavior into underlying and everyday. Underlying being measured through more dispositional traits, internal feelings, and everyday being measured more in terms of behaviors that we identify with, and then of course the overextended. If we turn this into items just to fully unpack how this is worked out, here are the underlying everyday overextended items for the trait of being collaborative. So I tend to naturally be trusting of others, that's underlying collaborative. Working in cooperation with others is a strength of mine, that's more everyday. Overextended, I spend too much time supporting others and can lose sight of my own needs, that's sort of too much of a good thing. And we can measure the opposite, we can measure competitive. So underlying, I believe in putting my own interests first every day. You know, I often outperform my colleagues, but if I overextend, sometimes I want to win, even if it means other people could lose out. So hopefully you get a feel for the structure of the model and how this balance is achieved. If I move now to the validity research that I'm presenting here, the purpose was to gather validity evidence for Lumina Spark, applying the leading methods of Professor Bartram from his classic paper in 2005, and also the Saville et al. Paper from 2009. A robust mapping has been undertaken here, and the purpose was to take the 4-factor version of Spark and map it to the Great 8 using the Great 8 concept as developed by Kurz and Bartram back in 2002, and to develop 8 marker items for the Great 8 based on the work of Kurz from 2003. In terms of the design methodology, this research is based on 375 professionals who both completed Lumina Spark but also got rate of feedback against the 8 items from the Great 8 model. We had quite a nice split, 53% female, 47% male and so on. Slightly older population. This was based on people in the working population that tended to be professional people or managers and above. So validity coefficients were calculated for the 24 traits by combining the underlying and everyday into one score. And each of the 24 measures therefore had 4 items in each scale. There are a few design limitations here. That the sample size of 375 is a reasonable sample size. but it would be good to replicate it in further studies. And we can't therefore generalise here into other industries, other sectors and so on. So a few words on the Great Eight. Kurz and Bartram developed it in 2002 and defined it. In 2003, Kurz developed a more applied version of the titles in the Great Eight, and then the paper from Bartram in 2005 did a meta-analysis. It showed the mappings from OPQ onto the Great Eight and advocated the use of a double weight for top scales and a single weight for two further scales to go from personality and turning it into a prediction of Great Eight performance at work. This was replicated and further applied by Saville, McClaver and Kurz in 2009. They repeated Bartram's methodology and extended it with the OPQ, the Saville Wave Professional, the Wave Focus, the SPQ, the NEO, the HPI and the 16PF, all correlated with Great Eight performance data, rater data, and all had the Bartram methodology with a double weight for the top scale and two further single weights for two further scales. And indeed, the study here with Lumina Spark faithfully reapplies the exact same methodology to the Lumina Spark data. So here we can see a model that shows the relationship between personality and the Great Eight. At the very top, we have the general factor of personality. As I explained earlier, one component to this is indeed evaluative bias, but there may well be more to it as well. We then have the two higher order factors, the alpha and the beta, or the stability and the plasticity. And then, of course, in the middle here, we have the big five. But there is an interface between the big five and competencies at work as we move into the Great Eight. And at the bottom half here, we can see that openness cracks out into creativity, but also analysis. Two different competencies at work that both require openness as a fundamental building block. Then we have conscientiousness, and this has been cracked out into the need for achievement and also dependability. Extroversion's cracked out into sociability and also the need for power, to be persuasive and so on. Agreeableness translates into supporting and cooperating with others, and neuroticism, or the reversed form of it, translates into adapting and coping as a Great Eight competence. Here indeed are the 8 items that we used in this research to measure the Great Eight: analysing situations, creating concepts, relating to people, controlling resources, respecting people, adapting to demands, delivering results, and driving performance. So 8 items we used to measure the Great Eight. And here indeed are the results. So you have the Great Eight on the horizontal. On the vertical are the 24 qualities measured in the Lumina Spark model. And there we have the correlation coefficients. If we home in on the statistically significant measures, that cuts out some of the noise and we start to see how some of the key relationships pan out. If we now apply the Bartram 2005 method that Saville et al. Applied also in 2009, we start to identify sort of empirically the highest correlations, and we would normally seek to find the highest one and give that a weighting of 2, and then other correlations 2 more, a weighting of 1. However, this is balanced with a theoretical perspective on what the Great Eight is measuring and what other research from Bartram and Saville has indicated. And an expert assignment has been made between the Spark qualities and the Great Eight. So if I clean the data up, so you can see what's got a weighting of 2 and a weighting of 1, you will see that in this particular research, the opposite of conscientiousness wasn't coming in with a rating, and indeed only part of extroversion is coming in. So not everything is represented in this model the way it panned out. This is bringing it down to the subset of qualities that were contributing to predicting the Great Eight, and you can also see the weighting that a scale was given overall in the third column in. So reliable is getting a slightly, or is getting the highest weighting, along with conceptual and imaginative down the bottom from big picture thinking or openness, as well as practical from the opposite of openness that we call down to earth. So creating scales based on these weightings of 2 and 1, and then correlating with performance. We can see across the top we have the grade 8 actual performance measured by raters, and the predictor of it based on the spark qualities is on the vertical, and then we have the correlation coefficient. So taking out everything bar the diagonal, this is the correlation between the forecast of analysing situations with the actual rater data is correlating 0.26. Now this is unadjusted data for reliability, it's just a raw correlation between the two. We could of course adjust, and these numbers would be appropriately higher if we were to do that. This compares favourably with the Bartram work and with the Saville research on this as well. If we take the grade 8 competencies and average these, we get an average correlation across all 8 of 0.29, which is, I do believe, an interesting and a solid result supporting the validity of the Lumina Spark model. There are some references here if you wish to read more. There's Bartram's paper from 2005, the Kurz and Bartram work 2002, more on Kurz individually 2003, and of course the Saville, McClaver and Kurz paper from 2009 in the handbook is available. There are some nice references on evaluative bias if you wish to explore that concept more as well. Finally, I just want to draw some key conclusions. So I do believe we have some good validity achieved here in terms of criterion validity on this development sample, and it is a successful application of Bartram's 2005 methodology as repeated by Saville et al. There is of course a need to cross-validate on further samples, and it would be extremely helpful to validate this methodology further with the 5-factor version of Lumina Spark, building in some of the Lumina emotion scales to do with emotional stability and neuroticism, or as we call them, risk reactor and reward reactor. So that's something for the future, for further research going forward. I do hope you found this summary of the talk I gave at the BPS Division of Occupational Psychology Conference up in Stratford-upon-Avon helpful. I hope it stimulated you. If anybody does want to know more, please do reach out to myself. I'd be delighted to share more of the data with you, engage with you, and so on. Thank you for your time.